Now we come to section 4, in which I have listed all the criticisms that have been leveled against the proposal contained in the book, and I respond to them in detail. One by one, I offer a reply to 10 criticisms or objections, and we will go over them briefly. The criticisms are as follows. The first one says, listen, with your system, banks would disappear, they would not be able to make money, and they would lose their reason for existing. Well, this objection makes no sense. It is absurd. Banks would maintain a 100% reserve ratio, so they would give up the business they currently engage in, the issuance of money. However, they would continue to provide legitimate services, such as cashier and bookkeeping services, financial intermediation, foreign exchange services, etc. Of course, their profits would be more modest, but they would still bring in a profit, just as the Bank of Amsterdam did, without any problem, for a century and a half. There were a great number of small banks, all of which were solvent, unlike now when the fractional reserve system invariably leads them to merge. Whenever a crisis arises, more mergers, more mergers. What have we heard in recent years? All savings banks should merge. Think about how many banks there used to be. When I was little, there were 20 or 30 banks in Spain. Only 3 of them are left now. Sometimes only the name remains. Santander Central Hispano. Well, the Central Hispano was removed, and now only Santander is left. You know what BBVA stands for, right? Bilbao, which was a bank, Vizcaya, which was another, Argentaria, which was yet another. And each bank in a merger is itself the result of many other mergers. In the proposed system, there would be a constellation of small banks. They would all be solvent, maintain a 100% reserve ratio, provide services, and charge for them. It is a significant error to believe banks would disappear, and a much larger error to believe credit would disappear, which is the second criticism. People often claim there would not be enough credit. Well, we will tackle this completely groundless criticism shortly. We will reply to it along with the sixth objection. The third objection says that the proposed model would penalize those who profit from the present system. For instance, we all frequently receive, or did in the past, cashier and bookkeeping services from the bank, apparently free of charge. But, as you all know, there is no such thing as a free lunch. Nothing in life is free. Since when do banks do anything for us free of charge? Do you think bankers are the little sisters of charity? No. The thing is, they lend out our money and make a large profit, so they can afford to occasionally say they are giving us some free services. At least that was true in the past. These days, banks are charging for every service they perform, cashier services, transfers, etc., as we are all finding out. In any case, even if those were free, so to speak, that would be an illusion. It does not correspond to reality. Furthermore, we need to compare precisely 2 sets of circumstances. One, in which those services are provided free, but the currency is manipulated and tends to lose purchasing power each year, and another, the proposed system, in which we would have to pay for all those services, like we do now, incidentally, but we would have a monetary unit that gained purchasing power each year in an environment of healthy, productivity-based deflation. So, the notion that we would be at a disadvantage, actually, I am sure we would come out ahead, though we cannot know a priori whether or not any particular person would come out ahead. This third objection does not constitute an argument for nor against our proposed system. If anything, it would be a very weak argument against it. The fourth criticism leveled at the model I propose is that it is an example of state intervention and threatens the freedom of the parties. This criticism has been formulated by certain members of the Austrian school, White, Selgin, and others, who, due to a lack of legal training, fail to grasp that a 100% reserve requirement is far from an example of arbitrary state intervention that infringes on the contractual freedom of the parties, but instead is simply an ontological requirement of the contract governing the deposit of any fungible good in general and the quintessential fungible good, money, in particular. Therefore, a 100% reserve requirement in no way constitutes intervention, but is a logical demand of the principles of property law. Now we come to the fifth objection, which says, look, even if you are right, Professor Huerta de Soto, it is impossible to swim against the tide. We might as well try to build a fence in the middle of the Atlantic Ocean. Financial innovators will always look for a way to evade the prohibition of fractional reserves. Their innovations will be introduced one way or another. Well, this objection is very flimsy as well. It is like saying, listen, we cannot possibly put an end to murder by poison because the technologies keep improving and increasingly sophisticated poisons are found, and not even the CSI team can accurately detect the traces of the latest poisons. Even if that is true, it is totally irrelevant because the important thing is to know that murder is a crime which must be met with the full force of the law. Well, the same applies in the area of a 100% reserve requirement. requirement. What we must know is that regardless of their legal guise, demand deposits and their equivalents call for the maintenance of a 100% reserve ratio. With that knowledge, economic agents, contracting parties, judges and arbitrators will be able to decide, depending on the circumstances, how to act in each case. And if some financial innovation is so complex that it initially conceals the existence of a fractional reserve, that does not detract one iota from our obligation to pursue this goal in all areas with all of our strength. The guidance this knowledge provides is enough to lead the vast majority of citizens to act correctly in their agreements and contracts, and to therefore maintain an economy which runs in a healthy, sustainable way, without economic cycles. The sixth criticism is the one I mentioned earlier. It was formulated by theorists like Joseph Alois Schumpeter, who defended artificial credit expansion based on the assertion that it was highly favorable because it permitted the financing of technological innovations and economic development. This is a very harmful idea because it is endorsed by many entrepreneurs who believe they have a right to easy financing for any project they can imagine. And in a market economy, as important as it is to grant financing for a project that will be profitable, it is equally important to deny it for a project that will be unviable. Many entrepreneurs are like runaway horses, and they need to be spurred on in the right direction, but also halted when they go in the wrong direction. Well, the factor that determines which projects should be financed and which should not is precisely the social rate of time preference, what we citizens are willing to save. This social rate gives rise to an interest rate that determines and coordinates investment in specific projects, those with an expected return that exceeds the interest rate. It also establishes which projects will be placed on the back burner until circumstances change, until people save more and the interest rate decreases. But it is senseless to argue everything should be financed and at 0% interest or even negative real rates, because that will stimulate economic development in the long run. Actually, that will hamper economic development in the long run. Economic development proceeds in a manic-depressive fashion. It seems quite robust, and then it declines. Quite robust again, and then it declines. In a bubble process, huge quantities of erroneous investments are made, and there is a geographical and temporal misallocation of resources, and these investments become worthless, a pure loss. In a system of sustained economic development, with a 100% reserve requirement, we would be spared all of that widespread malinvestment, and thus economic development would be much greater in the long run. We would be much richer now if we had had a healthy currency and a banking system not based on fractional reserves. On top of that, during bubble stages, capital consumption is encouraged. As we have already seen, consumers receive the wrong signals, and this also proves detrimental to development in the long term. In the end, dear students, only what has been saved can be invested, and what has been saved can be invested either wisely or foolishly. The current system gives rise to a widespread cyclical malinvestment of society's scarce savings. Meanwhile, in the proposed system, savings would tend to be invested wisely, soundly, and sustainably from an entrepreneurial standpoint. And of course, we would be spared all the suffering, effort, sacrifice, and the social suffering unemployment entails, the demoralization we are all experiencing now. It is unnecessary, and as I have remarked in class, it is surprising and shameful that nearly 2 decades into the 21st century, with all the economic agents in the world, we still have a financial system that is so archaic, so controlled, statist, and hostile to the principles that should shape a market economy like ours. And, what is an even greater outrage, each time a crisis hits, a scapegoat is sought and invariably found in the market economy, the free enterprise system, and the crisis provides a pretext for justifying further doses of intervention and statism from public authorities, which really takes the cake. This brings us to the 7th criticism, which states that a system with a 100% reserve requirement and a pure gold standard would be very costly because it would strongly stimulate gold mining. Certain economists have even estimated that 1% of the world's GDP would be devoted to the extraction of gold. Well, even if that is true, we need to consider the opportunity cost of the current fractional reserve banking system. Even if this estimate is accurate, we would be free of all central banks, and the thousands of civil servants who work for them would engage in providing services of value to households. They would produce valuable economic goods and services. In addition, we would be spared the massive destruction of capital which occurs in every economic cycle, and which far exceeds 1% of GDP. There are a number of studies on the topic. Of particular interest is one by Professor Garrison, and I mention it on page 779 of the book. There we find a list of the costs we would no longer have to bear, and we reach the conclusion conclusion that on balance, the net cost would be much lower with the proposed system than with the current system. The eighth objection states that under the proposed system, certain countries would strike it rich. For example, the former Soviet Union, currently Russia, which appears to have abundant gold reserves, and South Africa. This too is an absurd, fallacious argument. Even if it were true, says Rothbard, what difference does it make, since we would all come out ahead? And if certain countries, due to their natural reserves, were to benefit even more, well, good for everyone. We cannot let envy stop us from adopting the system most favorable to all, simply because some countries might profit more than we would. Besides, that is a false argument, because we must take into account not the gold reserves we believe exist in certain places, but the world's entire existing stock of gold, which, little by little, has been discovered and has accumulated throughout the history of civilization. In fact, if you study the distribution of the world's stock of gold, you will find it quite peculiar. The largest private reserves of gold in the world are in India. Indians value gold highly for cultural reasons, and even very poor Indians buy it for weddings, etc. And historically, the French have had a custom of keeping gold coins at home, under their pillows or in a sock. This custom has come from the monetary disasters they suffered with the assignats and the French Revolution, and with John Law's scheme, which we also discuss in the book. In any case, the distribution of gold is very uniform, including gold jewelry, a watch for instance. The gold reserves that lie, or are believed to lie, in certain geographical locations amount to only a tiny fraction of the entire existing stock of gold, which has been discovered and has accumulated gradually since the beginning of civilization, and is distributed in the most varied manner. The ninth objection, which one hears voiced occasionally, is that in a certain country, Argentina, a 100% reserve requirement was established and it was an utter failure. Well, I explain here that this measure was a deceptive one taken by General Perón, and although a 100% reserve requirement was established, the state controlled the money supply, and above all, it determined who could borrow money and who could not. A patronage system arose, along with inflation never before seen. Thus, the ninth objection is completely baseless. The 10th objection states that it is a utopian dream to think we can move to this system without an international agreement, and I explain here that such an agreement is unnecessary. If a relatively large economic area, like Russia for instance, in terms of its stock of gold, or the European Union, or the United States, were to lead the way, that would be sufficient to oblige all other countries to follow. In fact, when I have given these lectures in Russia, people have been delighted. I have a number of disciples who, in Russia, in Ukraine, have begun to issue a gold coin, and they are fighting for reforms in this area.